Welcome to our webinar on product development, expert advice and lessons learned during COVID. I'm Carolyn Lowell with Bone Zone, and joining me today is a stellar lineup of orthopedic industry veterans who will be sharing the insight that they've gained while leading their teams over the past year. As R&D and product development professionals, you know that everyday problem solving is innate to your work. But COVID has presented new and unforeseen challenges. And as we continue to live in this remote and virtual world, new challenges and circumstances continue to manifest. Our hope for today is that you receive insight and advice on how product development teams, no matter the size, are responding to the current environment. Before I introduce our speakers, I wanted to say a few comments about our sponsor. MW Life Sciences works with ambitious orthopedic manufacturers to accelerate their new product development. On the manufacturing side, the company handles medical device manufacturing and high precision components for everything from implants and surgical instrumentation to single-use disposable devices and assemblies. And on the design side, they'll partner with you to refine your designs so that you can improve performance and reduce cost while ensuring compliance with established and emerging regulations. No matter where you are in your product development process, MW Life Sciences can utilize its integrated end-to-end solutions to get you where you want to be. So thank you to MW for sponsoring today's webinar. Our speakers for today, they each bring more than 20 years leading R&D and engineering teams. Not only do they have experience in developing new technologies, but they have a track record of leading culture change and new strategies. Moderating our discussion is Paul Vasta, Chief Technology Officer at Gramercy Extremity Orthopedics. He is being joined by Bob Spiro, Senior Vice President, Biologics Development, Scientific and Clinical Affairs at Aesculap, as well as Chuck Jaggers, Vice President, Product Development at Osteomed. There will be an opportunity to ask our speakers questions after the panel discussion, so we encourage you to use the Q&A function to submit questions for once the panel discussion is over. So thank you to Paul and Chuck and Bob. Bob, if you'd like to show your camera and unmute yourself, we will get started. Thank you so much.
Great. Well, thank you, Carolyn. Thank you, Bone Zone and MW Life Sciences for hosting this webinar. I think the timing of this webinar is spot on because here we find ourselves in another point of transition with this whole pandemic. Last year at this time, we were trying to understand how much of an impact this was going to have. We were transitioning into dealing with the seriousness and the term, how long this was going to be with us. And then a few months later, summertime probably, we were starting to realize this wasn't going to go away anytime soon. And so we started to transition into a longer term perspective. What things did we need to put in place in our organizations to make sure that we continue to move forward and progress and do the things as close as we could before. Now we find ourselves with vaccines being dispersed to the population and on the cusp of another transition out of this really heavy social distancing environment that we're in into something that hopefully returns to a little bit close to normal, a new normal, if you will. And so I think this is a perfect time to look back, discuss the things that we've learned, and more importantly, take advantage of those things as we move forward into this post-pandemic new environment that we'll be entering, or we are entering currently. So with that, I think I'd like to start and give the listeners a base of reference for our own individual groups. The perspectives that we bring are based on the teams that we have, the culture that we're in, and the company that we work for. So let's start there. Chuck, I'm gonna turn it over to you and introduce everyone to your environment, your company, and the team that you have.
Sure. Thank you very much, Paul. And thank you to Bone Zone and MW Life Sciences for the opportunity to be here. Excited to talk about the topic, and a little background on Osteomed. Osteomed is now part of Acumed. So in this past year with COVID, additional challenge we had, which I'll talk about later, is combining two companies. So the Acumed Osteomed entity has two different campuses. For most of the year, we were mostly contained in the North Dallas area, a town called Addison, with all our personnel and facilities principally in one location other than our global sales chain. So it was a very easy environment, I think, for people to interface, communicate, and work together. So to your point, Paul, when COVID happened and everybody sort of scattered and went back to their own home, we went from an environment where we typically worked face-to-face to an environment where we had to now find ways to communicate, share information, documentation. And as everybody knows, in product development, documentation is the bane of our existence, but it's an important part of what we do and how we make sure our products are effective and compliant. So that's kind of the short background. Probably 250, 300 people in total. And we took the philosophy, because our facility in Addison has manufacturing in the building, that we would try to protect the manufacturing team to make sure, of course, that our supply chain stayed intact, that we continue to be able to produce parts and sell parts. And so principally, all the cross-functional people that you would normally think of in a product development team or function, then working from home and trying as much as possible not to walk into the building and potentially introduce, something from the outside into that building to protect the environment. So that was our manufacturing bubble, if you will. If anybody's been following, some of the sports finals, that's what we tried to do.
Perfect. Bob?
Great. Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Chuck, for that. And Carolyn and MW Life Sciences, appreciate the opportunity. So I represent Aesculap, the U.S. division of Aesculap. We are a member of the B. Braun family of companies, private family-owned German company, over 175 plus years old. So a lot of long-term sustainability. The U.S. division, a couple different sites here in the Lehigh Valley, about 300, 350 people, and then our sales force out across the country. I specifically oversee biologics, R&D, and medical scientific affairs for this U.S. division. So I have about 65 or 70 folks that I oversee. It's a very diverse group: biologists, engineers, machinists, regulatory quality, and manufacturing personnel. So it's a pretty diverse group. And that is also reflected in our product portfolio, which is very diverse, all the way from surgical instruments, sterilization containers, through spine orthopedic devices, and really in the deep end of the pool of biologic cell-based products. We're right in the middle of a very pivotal phase 3 trial for a cultured cell-based product. So it presented a lot of challenges, obviously, from a COVID standpoint. We did move to a remote working scenario about a year ago now. Very early on, we made that decision. But obviously, running a prototype machine shop and a GMP cell manufacturing facility, we had to adapt. We had to adapt to be able to keep those aspects running. And I think similar to what Chuck described, we developed some split shifts and kept teams separate so that we were able to keep them safe, but also continue to be productive from a manufacturing and prototype standpoint. Mm-hmm. The engineers on the spine and ortho side, they were all able to set up their own CAD/CAM workstations at home and able to work remotely. So that aspect worked very well. And I think the other impact was, obviously, we've all felt it from a travel standpoint. We cut back to really only essential travel. And that really, from my standpoint, was just clinical trial-related travel. We really kept that, which helped on the expense side. So from a profitability standpoint, I mean, there was an upside to COVID, but if I had to choose, I would not choose COVID again. So that's been the key, I think, working remotely or a combination of remotely, keeping the employees that did have to come in from a manufacturing, looking at the clinical trial builds of this cell-based product, keeping them safe and keeping them separated so that if we did have an incident where one member would come down with COVID, they weren't really exposing the entire team. We always had a backup team that was safe and separated from those individuals. So that's worked pretty well so far.
All right, great. Well, for me, I represent the small company side of things. Gramercy Extremity Orthopedics, or GEO as we call ourselves, is in our 6th year. And we're still a small company, less than 20 people. And we engage external contractors and consultants fairly frequently. Interestingly for me and GEO, as a small company, and those that are familiar with startups, there was one point in our early history where we didn't have an office. So remote was just a matter of necessity. It wasn't something that was forced upon us. So we kind of grew up with that. As the years progressed, we have an office and we have people come in like a normal business. But then during the time of last year of COVID, we, just like everyone else, really closed down the office and had everyone revert working from home again. It was a little bit of a distant memory to do that, but it wasn't completely unfamiliar to us because that's how we started. So really for the discussion, and I think my contribution to all this today is really about how we've migrated to take some of those early remote aspects and bring it into our culture today. There was a point in time where things started to loosen up and we brought some people back, but we still had others work remotely. We did kind of a shift. Some people would come in 3 days a week, and then the next group of people would come in the other 2, and then we'd flip-flop back and forth just to try to keep the population in the office down. Because it's a small group, we felt there was less risk of introducing the virus and passing it around among us. So probably unlike larger companies where you just got a lot of people coming in and out the door, it's probably been a little bit easier for us to transition back into a little bit of normalcy, I should say, even though we're far from that. So I think that's a good representation. I think everyone can get a feel for where we all have the perspective of how we've dealt with COVID and the social distancing aspect of it. But Bob, let me go back to you, because as in a multinational company, you're dealing with different time zones, you're dealing with different languages. I'm sure most people in your company speak English, but I've been in those situations, and so for the tools that you guys use, online meetings are one thing, but how, in terms of keeping everyone engaged, keeping everyone on task, so to speak, from a functional standpoint, operationally, tell us a little bit about the tools that work for you, how you handle those things, and how you keep the folks engaged on all over the world for you guys.
Sure. I mean, the simple part, the time zone thing, that was pre-COVID anyway. So we faced that, and we've worked around that issue pretty well over the years. That's less of it's a matter of scheduling the meetings at the right time. But there's some late or early morning meetings that are just a necessity there. That has continued on, and particularly from a remote standpoint, using it. We're a big Teams user as opposed to Zoom, but that timing of those aspects showing up was what really helped that aspect from a time zone standpoint, and keeping in touch with our overseas partners. Germany was hit pretty hard as well in this COVID, so it's affected them from a manufacturing standpoint. So for the rest of the business outside of biologics, so some back order issues from a manufacturing standpoint. It's been a challenge from that aspect, from our parent company supplying the U.S. division with product. Regionally, what's worked very well, obviously, started off right away. Communication was key, and from executive staff on down, we set up a COVID task force. So there were weekly meetings with the task force. There was a lot of communication, both from the B. Braun side and Aesculap side regionally about COVID task force. How were we handling this? What was the protocol to move forward? And I think there was no way you could over communicate at that aspect of it. So it was a sense of security, I think, for employees that executive staff was thinking about this very seriously. And as I said, we moved to full remote working very early on. And I think it's a credit to executive staff there as well. So starting with frequent communication meetings within my own groups, using Teams or using Zoom was very helpful. And from standpoint of everyday working, we worked pretty quickly to implement the types of shifts that we needed from a manufacturing prototype standpoint. Got the engineers up to speed at home as well. So I think we were pretty fast in terms of getting people comfortable with working remotely. So a lot of meetings initially, but then it was really important to tailor that back and not to overwhelm people with meetings every hour on the hour. It gets very tiring sitting, I think, as you all know, sitting in front of a computer for an extended period of time. So it's about balance was important. We stressed that with our employees, that it's important to step away, take a break from your computer, and get some time away from the work aspects of it. Number one priority was keeping our employees safe, and I think we did a good job of that. And I think the last part, most important, is really constant acknowledgement and appreciation of their commitment to continue working, and also their patience through all this COVID aspect. I think that type of positive feedback plays a good role in keeping people motivated.
Let me ask you, online meetings were one thing. Did you guys take advantage? I know Teams has an instant messaging. There's emails. Did you take advantage of the full gamut of communication channels?
Yeah, we did. I know it got a little confusing between text on your phone, text through Teams, and so I was getting hit from 4 different angles with text and messages. So yeah, we had to prioritize, I think, that level of communication. But yeah, absolutely, we took advantage of all of that.
Great. And Chuck, I know I want to get into what you had talked about earlier. You had 2 companies that were coming together. That was a challenge in and of itself, I'm sure. Why don't you give us a little bit of your what you did in terms of functional tools, methods, approaches to kind of do all that and bring those teams together and engage everyone?
Sure. And I just really echo some of the points Bob made. I think we all laughed when we said, hey, it got a little confusing between text messages, Ring Central, all these things, because quite honestly, we didn't use those nearly as heavily before COVID hit. And I have to say that the whole organization and everyone involved adapted almost seamlessly to that. So there wasn't a necessity as much for us to go to it. But once it became apparent, you're going to have to try to find a way to continue to have these interactions and these meetings. People adapted very, very quickly. And I think the key for the merger, more specifically to your question, was senior management recognizing, hey, this is a challenging time. This is not a normal merger, and mergers are difficult at best. Even when you have a normal methodology where people can typically get on a plane and go fly across and meet at a facility and talk with people there, and vice versa. So you can see the capabilities, you can see the facilities. We have had to rely heavily on a team approach, so breaking down into systems and processes, which you would normally do, but then doing that remotely. And I would say, the tools that you use are critical to that. So we've adopted over time. Originally, we started off with Zoom and Ring Central. That is still our base at Osteomed, our phone system. But now we've started to move very quickly to Microsoft Teams. And, every system has its challenges, but Teams allows you to share information, documentation quickly, bring people together in a meeting, review a document, edit it, live, do all of those things. And of course, we have the usual challenges, right? People are working from home. So this person has a low level bandwidth, this person has a high level bandwidth, and trying to make sure that all those things worked. And initially it's funny because you start off with a lot of video conferencing, but video conferencing does eat up bandwidth as well. So typically then we'd get everybody on the call. You kind of, say hi and then shut down your video and then get to work. As time went on and people got to know each other. So you kind of hit on a natural rhythm of how people handle these calls and participate. And I think as a culture, we'll talk about lessons later on, but I think it reinforced for people, we can adapt, we can do things differently. And that's important to the overall, thought process and psyche of the organization going forward, especially as you're combining two organizations.
Yeah, and that actually, as you were talking, the cultural aspect is so important, and you have this 2D representation of a person on your computer screen. And so you had groups that had, I'm guessing there were people that had never met each other before.
Right.
So, what was the did you see a lot of challenge? I know you talked about the adaptation, but I'm just curious as to, how that was able to happen, where you could get that trust, that camaraderie with people that never met each other before and are only looking at a video.
Yeah, it's there's no doubt about it. It's a challenge. I mean, you have to, I think one of the tools that we just started to employ, there's an external entity that we utilize to come in and ask a series of questions of people. And so in these small groups of people getting together with this outside entity and the tool that they're using to answer questions about what are the biggest challenges I've faced? What frustrates me when I go to work every day? What am I excited about? What's the potential? What type of organization am I looking for? And just that exchange of people, sharing that information helps everyone to step back. And I think talking to other small groups, we're typically not supposed to be, sharing everybody's intimate thoughts that they had in these cultural meetings, but you realize everybody throughout the organization kind of steps back and goes, they're going through the same thing I am. They're having the same issues that I'm having on this side. We're not that different. And, it's to your point about 2D, it's back to the principle of, hey, we're all people here. We do a job, but the job is not at the end of the day what everybody goes home and bases their entire life around. There's a whole person here. There's a whole, life that goes around work, and work is a piece of it, but it's not everything. And so getting to that point where people realize that, and as you said, develop that more, intimate relationship that's not 2D, that was a tool that we employed recently, and it was really, really helpful to kind of break down a few of those barriers.
Yeah, it sounds like you guys were really on point with how you merged everyone and giving everybody a chance to interact beyond just the business sense of our normal interactions day to day. For us, as I said, we had the tools kind of to begin with. We also utilized Ring Central. It's a phone system, but it also provided online, and actually their engine uses Zoom also. So this is a familiar format for me. But one of the things that we started with was, because we're a small company, we didn't have the resources to bring in a whole IT team and set up servers and everything inside. So we use cloud-based file servers for all of our documentation. And within those websites, you have comment capabilities, you have requests for tasks and doing things. So you can ping people, can't really directly message them, but you can, through emails and things, everyone can interact on documentation and things like that independently as they want, yet still have this communicative interaction going on with each of those documents. So that seemed to work really well for us. The other thing that I was thinking of from a functional standpoint was, we don't use IM instant messaging really in the organization. It's either email or text or this interaction through our file server. But one of the things that I find, and we talked about this before, was when you're on a video call and I'm talking, I can see Bob nodding, I can see Chuck nodding. If you've got your videos off, you get this removal. I understand about the bandwidth, but Bob, I assume with the remote groups that you have, probably people have never met each other face to face in certain circumstances. Do you guys? I was going to say enforce, but let me rein that back. You encourage people to have this visual undertone to the communication that goes on with your teams.
Yeah, it's actually come up a couple of times. Yeah, I think initially, yeah, some folks are a little more shy in terms of video, but we have encouraged having videos on just for all the reasons you mentioned, Paul. I mean, seeing the head nods or the yeses or nos visually, and I think it's just another level of connection that you don't have if your video is off. So, yeah, there's no ramifications of not having it on, but and I don't call people out on it, but we do encourage, and most people I think have been very good about it. Very good.
Yeah, us too. Let's move to outside groups and interactions with outside groups. We'll be talking about our own internal culture and how important that is, and I've got some thoughts on that as we go further into the closing. But dealing with outside groups, dealing with surgeons, dealing with clinicians. That's a little bit of a different animal. At least it is, in my experience. And Bob, I know you're the one of the three of us that really have to deal with the clinical aspects. You've got CROs that you work with. You've got researchers, those types of folks outside of the organization. Tell us your experiences in interacting and keeping those folks engaged.
Yeah, I think the clinical trial aspect has been very challenging on the business side, but and I'm not exposed as much of it, but from a sales standpoint, it obviously had an impact as well, being able to visit customers face to face. So it had an impact on the business side, but on my research and development side, yeah, running a clinical trial in the midst of a COVID pandemic was certainly challenging. You have all of our products across the entire portfolio. We're dealing with elective surgeries for the majority of this. So that obviously one of the first things that got shut down was elective surgeries. If you take it to research level, clinical trial level surgeries, that's another level down. So it's, even though some elective surgery sites came back, we were still shut down for, I would say, at least almost 2 quarters last year with surgeries being shut down. FDA, to their credit, was very proactive in coming out with guidances for running clinical trials during a COVID pandemic, and I think they're showing some leniency and obviously identifying and knowing the challenge in terms of continuing these trials. It's particularly with a cell-based product with limited shelf life. From a shipping standpoint, every angle you could tackle it from, it was going to be a challenge. This is a long trial, 2-year follow-up, so you're talking about 26 study visits for each patient. Mm-hmm. We did implement early on electronic questionnaires and things at that level, but it's still not having the site, being able to visit the sites or have the patients come in for their study visits created quite a challenge. So you had visits that were outside of the study window. It was supposed to be a 2-week follow-up. It ended up being sometimes 2 to 4 weeks. And that's where the FDA, I think, will show some leniency in those type of out-of-study visits. So at every level from a clinical trial standpoint, it created a challenge, and it did shut it down. Most companies actually just suspended their trials during the bulk of last year. We were able to get back up and running after about a 3-month delay. As soon as sites came back to that research level, we were able to implement some of these aspects of electronic questionnaires, and getting in touch with patients from a electronic standpoint as opposed to requiring study visits. The shipments, particularly to Canada, we have Canadian sites, was probably the biggest challenge because that border shut down pretty aggressively and still there. So that with a cell-based product, limited shelf life, particularly that implant, getting it back to the clinic, it got dicey. It was pretty dicey from that standpoint. And FedEx, with the weather issues we had on top of COVID, shipping regionally and across the country became quite a challenge from that standpoint. But I'd say the biggest challenge had been not being able to get to the sites and not being able to have the patients come in for their study visits. So it was we're talking about 300 patient studies. So we had to do some pretty fast and efficient communication to get in touch with every single patient to explain the types of things we're going to implement to help them.
So were there one or two things from this experience in this past year that you see as potentially advantageous to bring forward, even when the travel restrictions end and the borders open and those types of things?
Just from the clinical trial standpoint, I think it's the more you move to remote and electronic the patient-reported outcome questionnaires, which I think most companies are doing. I think that's getting away from the paper system is a big advantage. And I think some leniency from an FDA standpoint in terms of study visits and being able to do it remotely it certainly helped. And I think that will continue. I think this was an interesting challenge from an FDA standpoint as well.
Mm-hmm.
They, again, very proactive and got on this right away.
Well, that's great to hear. And Chuck, working with outside surgeons in product development, and if you have other firms and researchers and engineers that you work with outside the organization, but particularly surgeons, doing validation labs or just doing engineering labs with them, what were the challenges that you guys faced, and what were some of the key things you did to overcome them?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. We have the advantage of having a cadaver lab in our building. So typically when we're getting to that validation point, you're bringing the surgeons in to run through a full-blown cadaver lab, and the best way to handle that typically is to have multiple surgeons interacting in the cadaver lab. They can provide their feedback individually, but then as a group, they can also, interact with each other and exchange information, and it gives you a better picture of, are you really hitting those goals that you established when you first put your design inputs together and tried to come up with the correct voice of the customer representation in your product. So it started off with, well, how are we going to do this? Nobody had a process.
Yeah.
So we had to define a process. We had to come up with a way that we were going to do it. And the way we settled on, which I think was probably the correct way, just to err on the side of safety, protecting the clinicians who obviously are out doing a very important job outside of the one we asked them to do, was to bring them in one by one. So instead of having multiple tables set up with multiple surgeons in the cadaver lab, we went to a one table system. We had to come up with a process for bringing people into the building, particularly people that were from outside our community in most cases, the small community of Osteomed and the community of North Dallas and the Dallas area, flying those people in, making sure they were comfortable, making sure that they knew what our protocols were and what the protections were that were in place for those people. And I have to say the surgeons responded extremely well to it. They really stepped up. I was fearful when we got to that validation place that we were not going to be able to get, the people to come in and do the work. It did, to a certain extent, extend what the timeline for what we were doing, but it didn't halt it. And I think that's a credit to the organization and the people working together, particularly our HR department and then our meeting services group that always is at the forefront of setting up a lab like that to get that all done. At a point we didn't even know, well, can we get cadavers? What's the protocol here? How hard is this going to be? But I think in the end, it worked out really well. I think it helped us see, in some places where we had to refine our process a little bit, maybe make it a little bit more clear as to what happens, because when we didn't have these restrictions, you can always grab a phone, pick it up, talk to somebody and say, hey, fix this or do that. And you had people in the building that could address those issues. Now we had to make sure that everybody was clear on what they were doing and when exactly they were doing it, versus just running down the hallway, knocking on somebody's door and saying, hey, we need this. Can you come get it?
Yeah.
If you don't have a camera or you don't have the right equipment in the room, it could be a little bit disastrous when you're going to the expense to fly one individual in to do a lab. So.
Yeah. No, and in my fantasy world, we have a cadaver lab too in the back, but unfortunately, I have to operate in reality. So we've done some validation labs in the past year, not a lot, As a small company, we don't do a lot anyway. But one of the things that we looked at, because we're not bringing surgeons in, and we didn't want to be flying around the country to a bunch of different people, we were fortunate enough to have the connections, I guess, to do a lab with a group of surgeons that already work together. So we went to one place and we still had multiple surgeons that were able to come in. They weren't concerned because it's their facility, they already work together. So that's one little way that we ended up getting around that, and it seemed to work. It can't work all the time, obviously, but if you can get that situation to your advantage, take advantage of it. One of the other things that as we were talking, that I thought of was during the development process, as you're working with surgeons and developing. Hadn't done this in the past. Maybe you have, maybe listeners have, but we started using additive manufacturing, 3D SLAs or multi-jet fusion. As we were developing iterations of the products, we would send them out. They're cheap, they're quick, they're easy to, you send them out to the surgeons, and then you get on a video call with them, and they can hold something in their hand rather than going to meet them and all that. So that was another aspect that worked well for us during this year. And honestly, I plan to carry that forward. It's really easy in this day and age. So as we're getting close to the end here, let's talk about the lessons learned and the things that you really see are going to be carried forward in the world after COVID. Let's put it that way. Bob, why don't you start?
Sure. I think first and foremost, I mentioned we're a family-owned, very old German company. I think what we learned through this is that working from a remote standpoint, you can be successful. And this is a company that really, I would say, dead set against it previously, but I think challenged whether that was feasible or not. But I think we've proven now over the last well over a year that working remotely can be successful. You can be successful at it, and it really presents a much better work-life balance for your employees. And I think it's probably the biggest positive that came out of it. I think the other aspect is I mentioned expenses, not traveling. I think we've learned that you could still be successful again by keeping a track of your expenses. T&E is probably one of the biggest hits we face from a company standpoint. Yeah, and the fact that I think these remote type of teams and Zoom scenarios present another way to do business. And even from a convention and association standpoint, the big convention meetings, we shut all those down last year. I don't think you do that 100%, but I think metering your expenses, working remotely, I think it's two big takeaways that I think we've shown have an impact, I think, from an employee morale standpoint, but also from a business success standpoint. So, and then from a trial standpoint, again, working with FDA, different ways to, I think, adapt these clinical trials to these type of scenarios that make it easier on the subjects, easier on the company. I think that was a big step forward as well. Hopefully FDA continues along that.
Yeah, great. Chuck?
I think being flexible is really the key catchphrase, just flexibility. As Bob said, 100% agree with everything he said. We didn't have the urgency or the push to adapt to some of these conditions, remote work conditions, but it can work, and it can work really, really well. In fact, I'm in about a month, I'm going to go meet a friend of mine out in New Mexico who's coming from Colorado, and he's on a different company, and I'll leave the name out of it, but he's going to be on the road for a month. And I said, how the heck are you doing that? Well, I've got an RV travel trailer. I outfitted it with internet. He says, I've got my desk, my laptop, and that's not to say that's what everybody needs to do or can do. But I think as companies, we have to be very flexible in our thinking about how we're going to manage these types of situations, not a COVID pandemic, but just product development and the normal everyday running of the business. And you have to, I think, put yourself a little bit in the shoes of the employees and what they're doing. And all of us on this panel are of a certain age group, and the engineers that are coming into the workforce, are expecting to have, whether it's a quality engineer, a manufacturing engineer, R&D engineer, whoever it is, they're expecting to have, a little bit of flexibility in what they can do and when they can do it. And as Bob said, we've managed it. We've done it well. I think the tools we developed have made it a lot easier to manage it. And you see companies on the stock market doing very, very well because people are grabbing those tools and using them every day. And there's a mix there. And I saw one of the questions on the chat about work-life balance. That's where we're really going to have to focus, right? Because there is a blurring of the lines between work and home life. And the companies are going to need to address that and be, again, flexible with how we manage it and how we help people maintain their personal life as well as their professional life.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And one of the things that I'm taking away, and I think we'll continue to implement, and it's unquestionably much easier for a small company along those lines, is you also have to assess the personality of the individual. And I think both of you hit on that as you were talking about different things. Some people just adapt like fish to water working remotely. They are self-starters. They don't mind, instant messaging someone or communicating, and there are others that are a little bit more reserved in their openness to communication. And so, I see going forward really implementing, as you can, a hybrid model. And I think you guys all have that thought in mind as well. But really assessing it from not only their job function and their role, but from a personality type. Is this person more adapt to be able to work from home? Let them work from home. If not, maybe they should come in a few times a week, because I forget which one of you mentioned, there's nothing like walking down the hall on the spur of the moment, just leaning up against the door frame and saying, hey, what do you think about this? As great as all this technology is, that's something I don't think you can ever replicate electronically. So go ahead.
I'll just throw in there as you're saying that, Paul. We talked about kind of the bubble. We have what, if you will, a supply chain bubble in our building. Well, those people are in there every day, right? So they're in there working. We're not necessarily there interacting directly with them on a daily basis. So one of the things we realized is, hey, we've just got to, whether you need to or not, you've got to walk in there and at least somebody, make that contact. Last week, we had one of our key salespeople come in and just walk into the back with a box of donuts and talk to people, walk around the building, say hello, say, appreciate what you guys are doing. I know it's been tough. Really, appreciative of how you're managing things. And that's true at any time, but it just becomes more acute in a situation like this. And hopefully we take away as a key learning, those interactions are important. The face-to-face things do have to happen, and you do need to, as somebody mentioned, just be appreciative of the effort level people are putting in and how they're handling it.
Yeah. Any closing thoughts, Bob?
I think I mentioned the last thing Chuck just touched upon, the acknowledgement and showing appreciation for the folks that do have to come in and, as essentially put themselves at risk over the last year. I think, and that was an important part. Also, we would ship in food and snacks occasionally to keep all those folks happy while they're working. But I think, overall, it'll be a new environment. It will be a hybrid model of remote and face to face. And I think work-life balance is important, especially attracting young talent. I think that was a great point, Chuck. I think they all are expected and are looking for it, and it's actually not a bad way to work. So I think that's a key takeaway.
Yeah, absolutely. I wholeheartedly agree with you both. I think this was a mixed blessing. Obviously, it was a horrible impact in multiple ways on the world. But I think it also opened our eyes to a lot of ways that we can do better. Just in so many ways. Thinking about let alone how much you miss personal interaction with people or going to restaurants. There's an appreciation that can come out of this. And I hope that we sustain that. And I think that companies can look not just at the cranks that are turning in their organizations, but as you guys have all mentioned multiple times now, the culture and the personality and the people that are part of that system. So I think we'll go ahead and leave the discussion part of that with the audience. And I think there's some questions. Carolyn, do we have questions that we can answer for the listeners out there?
We do have a couple questions. To the question that Chuck alluded to, it was talking about the blurring line between work time and personal time. And I think that you as a panel addressed it a little bit, but I was wondering if there are any specific examples. I know in speaking to others in the industry, there is fatigue from working from home. And I know some companies have said, on this day, we're not going to be turning our cameras on, or work stops at 5 p.m., no emails after this hour, different types of, rules essentially that weren't in place before. So would anybody like to address that further?
Chuck,
I'll just jump in. Yeah, we did we've recently implemented a, no meeting Wednesday. We're just in the early stages of it though, but I think people do appreciate it. And by the way, it is Wednesday, so a little bit bigger smile on my face, a little bit more energy. But you can get into this meetingitis type of situation. Bob mentioned it early on, where you've got so many meetings happening for people to get together, and I need to talk about this. And normally I just walk into your office. There is a balance there. There was a balance when we were in the office where you couldn't get anything done because somebody's always walking into your office, right? So we kind of have to, remember the balance of those things. But I think for people at home, and each individual is different, as you noted, you have to adjust for your situation, your family situation. I think employees being, not being militant about it, but talking with their manager and saying, look, this is really, I had to do another meeting at 7:00 last night. I mean, I'm supposed to be at my kid's basketball game or whatever it is. You managers have to be, like we said, flexible. They have to be adaptive. They have to adapt to each person's situation. And there can be that blurring, and it is fatiguing. And when you recognize that that's happening, or that's happening to your people, we all as managers have to think about ways we can improve that and take away some of that fatigue. I think a no meeting day is a great way of going about it. We all have things to do that, quite frankly, we don't need other people around to do. So it can slow you down if you have to keep interacting when you say, gosh, if I could just get 5 minutes. And engineers are certainly not the most social people on the planet. So sometimes you need that little break to recharge your batteries.
No greater truth has been told.
While we're on the topic of remote work, do you think employers will be more open to remote employees going forward?
Well, I know as a small business, I would say absolutely, with a caveat, and I think that probably is universal. Again, you have to weigh the role that they're playing and the responsibilities, and then the personality, and that's a tough thing to assess. But I don't think, at least in my world, there would be any negative aspect. We have people that completely work remotely for us. So for me, that's fine. Better to hear from folks in larger companies for better perspective. Bob.
Yeah, I touched upon it. It was, it was an old school company. It has been obviously for a long time, but this was an eye opener. I came from the West Coast, a series of startups. It was an entirely different environment, and sort of a culture shock coming here. But again, I think we've learned over the last year, it can be efficient. It can be efficient from not only productivity, but a cost saving standpoint, to be able to support remote working. But I just go back to, again, Chuck's main point: to attract young talent, these folks are coming in expecting that kind of work-life balance. We hear it all the time. We've been through a 7 or 8 year culture shift movement here in the U.S., and we always solicit feedback every year for directions we should head in. And I can tell you, every single year it was the same things coming up: work from home, work-life balance. So we were hearing it for a number of years, and it really took the COVID pandemic to force us to show that it can be done remotely. So I think that's the key part of this. Is it really opened our eyes, and it can be successful.
Great.
And one more question. This person says, as a manufacturer of custom medical demonstration models and surgical trainers, what opportunities have been raised that can better help medical device companies continue to move their training and sales initiatives forward?
Well, that's a good question. Anybody want to jump on that one?
I mean, I can address it from a clinical trial surgical training standpoint. Obviously, it was cadaver labs that we would have to use, to bring a site up to speed from a training standpoint. But we've started to try to do this remotely with new surgeon training videos. I still think a hands-on, especially for this clinical trial, is necessary. But we've gotten a lot of mileage out of training videos, and we've kind of upped the ante in terms of using those from that standpoint. And even through just a live video kind of feed, we've been able to move that needle a little bit. But I don't think that can take over entirely, but you can certainly supplement that.
Yeah, I agree with you, Bob. I think that is critically important. We've had to get better at it. We've definitely had to improve that part of our business and really focus more people on the training initiatives. And I agree with you. I think you can do an awful lot with the remote training, but you can't do everything with it. And so, I think it's going to be important for people when we get back to what we would call more near normal, having parts in your hand, being able to play with those, being able to demonstrate the surgical technique, things like that are just irreplaceable in it, because that's how surgeons operate, right? It's hands-on. So, but I do agree. I think we have gotten better at it, and I think we have to continue to get better at providing that remote kind of virtual learning environment. Yeah.
And especially one thing that is kind of the underlying cause here too, is that surgery centers and hospitals, at one point had zero tolerance for anybody else coming into their facilities. That's kind of loosened up a little bit, but I see that going forward. They see the advantages of that. And, that's another point that makes it extremely difficult to be in person with your target audience, be it a surgeon or a nurse or scrub tech or anybody else.
Paul, I think your additive manufacturing prototype pathway is valid as well. We started that even pre-COVID, being able to go with a plastic prototype, get it into a surgeon's hands and get that feedback, as opposed to waiting for a metal prototype to be put together. It really did a much more efficient process even prior to COVID. So that's obviously going to carry on as well.
Yeah, and certainly for a global organization, you're trying to talk with a surgeon that's in multiple time zones away from you. That's a very difficult proposition. And so having something in their hands, a small PowerPoint that they can go through, they look at the parts, they review the features, and then jumping on a call makes a big difference in doing that. And you said it, Bob. I think what we've realized is we don't always need to be jumping on a plane at the drop of a hat to go do something and see a surgeon. You do have to have that, and you prefer to have that personal interaction, but it's not necessary for everything we're doing all the time.
Great. I think we will leave it there unless anybody has any final thoughts that they would like to share.
Thank you. Thank Bone Zone. Thank MW. It's just been, like I said at the onset, a very timely topic to talk about as we transition into this quote unquote new normal. So thank you all. And Bob and Chuck, thank you. It's been a pleasure speaking with you guys, and I hope this isn't the last time.
Very much enjoyed it. Thanks, everybody.
Really enjoyed it. Thank you for setting this up and taking the hard work to get this all going. It's been very enjoyable.
Great. Well, thank all of you. We really appreciate the insight that you provided today and the lively discussion that you were able to have. Of course, also, yes, want to thank MW Life Sciences for their support and sponsorship of this webinar. And thanks to all of you who are watching. If you'd like to access this webinar again or share this on demand with your colleague, it will be available on the Bone Zone website on March 30th to access, as well as more great content on best practices and navigating through this environment can also be found at bonezonepub.com. So thank you all so much, and I hope you have a great day. Thank you.